the lieutenant governor of the island for the East India Company, and Mrs. Skelton, whose welcome the emperor had appreciated when the day after landing he had come to Longwood with the admiral, came to Longwood to take their leave before sailing for England on one of the company's ships. The emperor had always received with pleasure Colonel and Mrs. Skelton, who had many times had the honor of dining with him. He could not entrust more honest people with the grievances he had against the governor in order for them to reach high places in London. Wishing to add to the trust he showed them, he asked me for one of the lovely cups of his Sevres porcelain, which he offered as a memento of his esteem to Mrs. Skelton. This lady thanked him warmly while expressing her admiration for the paintings on it. As can be seen, the emperor continued to receive not only the island notables and the officers of the garrison, whom he invited either to dinner or to lunch under his tent if it was morning. He also received all the distinguished people landing on the island. The uneasy mind of the governor was rather alarmed by this. The slightest details coming out of Longwood took on great importance in his eyes, but he was worried to the highest degree about Dr. O'Meara's constant errands into town, over whom he could not and dared not exercise any control, being free to communicate with the island inhabitants and the officers of ships in the harbor. He could convey to General Bonaparte news of Europe that the governor wished to have him know only after it had been filtered through him. Toward this goal, he did everything he could to convince the emperor to take in his service Dr. Baxter, who, he said, spoke French and was far more worthy than Dr. O'Meara. He failed, however, in his attempt, for the emperor told him he was perfectly satisfied with his doctor and wished to keep him. As can be readily imagined, the emperor was not fooled by the governor's expressed interest in his health, being better cared for by Dr. Baxter than by Dr. O'Meara. He saw in this persistence the governor's desire to have near him a man of his own choosing. It can be imagined that Dr. O'Meara, who was not subject to any of the Longwood restrictions, was too precious a resource for the emperor to voluntarily part with him. Although a marked change had occurred since restrictions had been placed on the colonists and the garrison officers in communicating with us, the emperor nevertheless knew what was going on both on the island and elsewhere. Hudson Lowe, in his desire to see only men of his choosing around the emperor, wrote to the Grand Marshal that he was going to replace the sailors working as servants, either in the stables or the household, with soldiers, believing no doubt that he could exercise more influence on them than on the sailors from the Northumberland. The emperor refused this, and the sailors remained until the vessel departed. They each received a good bonus and were then replaced by soldiers from the 53rd Regiment, who served very well and gave no occasion for complaint. One matter that concerned the emperor was the lack of compatibility between Generals Gourgaud and Montholon. Time had only increased this disagreement to the point where they were going to fight a duel. A duel at Longwood between two men who, on arriving, were motivated by the same goal of easing the emperor's captivity was quite impossible. The emperor intervened and summoned them. He preached conciliation and disarmed them both with his paternal words. A few words uttered by General Gourgaud annoyed the emperor, and he said to them, "Much as I like to have you near me if you live together in peace, you disturb me if you cannot share with me the few joys that are left to us. I would prefer to see you both go. It would be quieter if I were alone with Marchand." It is not very modest on my part to recall this last sentence that concerns me. If I do so, it is because I must attribute it to a burst of temper on the part of the emperor, occasioned by the general's reply. The emperor, if left alone, would have quickly realized the deep solitude in which he would have found himself with only me near him, when everything that surrounded him barely sufficed to occupy the prodigious activity of his mind. One day, when the emperor had received distinguished foreigners who were passing through the island, Dr. O'Meara told him the next day, as he was dressing, how much these people had been charmed by his conversation, and how ashamed they were to have believed the libelous lies written about him. He added this impression was widespread among all the people who had the honor of being received by him. "Doctor," the emperor said to him, "your compatriots imagine that I am some kind of ferocious horned beast?" It is true the press had lashed out against me as it has done to no one else. It has described me as cowardly and bloodthirsty. All this slander will disappear of its own accord. These Englishmen coming from India will go to France, and there they will learn to know me even better. Your governor asked me to receive him. I was in my robe. I did not want to, but I allowed him to come and disturb me. He made the most animated protests about his wish to make my position more bearable. He reverted to his adored theme of placing Baxter near me. He was going out of his way to please me. But he is a man in whom I could have no trust whatsoever. My disgust for him is such that when he left, I told Marchand, "Throw away this coffee. It is not fit to be drunk because it was near him." In spite of myself, I mistreated him. But how could it be otherwise? He forbids us to write, and he worries our words might be heard elsewhere than on this rock, and might reach Europe. He has it in for Las Casas, who he says writes lies to Europe, which I am quite certain is not true. He claims he attempts to send him down in my esteem. He has not spoken to me of his quarrel with Bertrand, who was forced to drive him out of his house because of the rudeness he displayed. It must have been very great indeed for Bertrand to have reached that point, for he is the most conciliatory person one could ever meet. Doctor, he would like to regain lost ground, but he shall not succeed. All that I ask of him is not to annoy me with his odious presence. It had occurred to the government to build a more suitable house than the one in which the emperor was living. When the Grand Marshal brought the plans, the emperor said to him, "I would much prefer 400 or 500 books. I would enjoy them. It will take 5 years to build this house, and by that time, all I will need is a grave." The emperor turned out to be a good prophet. 5 years later, he had reached the last days of his life when they came to offer him the keys to this new house. "I have seen," he said, "all of the trouble taken by these poor sailors and soldiers to manage to achieve very little at Longwood. They were under the orders of the admiral, who is an active and intelligent man. I do not want them to be overwhelmed with work that I will not be in a position to benefit from, and have them curse me because of it." The Grand Marshal thought, however, that he should ask him which location of the island would please him most. He answered that the Briars appeared to be the best, because there he would find shade and water, or else Rosemary Hall, or Colonel Smith's property. Finally, he said that any other part of the island where he would be sheltered from the southeasterly winds that consumed Longwood, covered with rain and fog, or overwhelmed by a sun that cooked his brains. But can't you see, Bertrand? This request is nothing but a joke. Any other part of the island than this one, they will not give to me. It offers too many advantages for them to take me away from it. I cannot take one step without being noticed. It took a year to build your house. How long do you think it will take to finish this one? If he speaks to you of it, tell him that he can put it wherever he wants and leave me alone." The emperor was perfectly right. Some time after this, the governor, free to choose location, decided this house should be built below and near that of Count Bertrand, sheltered from the southeast wind by a fold in the terrain, close enough to the company gardens to enjoy them, and within sight of the camp, so that he could not take one step without being spotted. There would be abundant water when the construction of a huge cistern at Diana's Peak was completed. This reservoir was to collect during the rainy season all the water needed, not only to supply Longwood, but also to supply the island and the ships coming from India that stopped there to take on water. The emperor's life on this rock was almost always the same, divided between work, reading, and trips on horseback in the morning in the company of General Gourgaud and Count Las Casas. If he took his carriage in the evening, it was in the company of one of the ladies, or sometimes both of them. If it happened he should deviate from this type of existence, it was because he was ill and remained at home. The sudden changes in the weather, against which he took no precautions, were often the cause of bad colds that would set in and keep him to his bed. Dr. O'Meara then offered his pharmacy, but the emperor always countered this with his candy box of licorice. "My method, if I am ill," he said, "is to fast, take a little chicken broth, and in order to work up perspiration, I cover 5 or 6 leagues on horseback and then put myself to bed." One day the emperor was ailing and kept to his bed. He summoned the doctor. "Yesterday you had company for dinner. How many of the men were drunk?" Not one of them, the doctor replied, laughing. You are not telling the truth. There must have been a few of them under the table. Was our friend Captain Ross not slightly inebriated? Feeling good, yes, but inebriated, no. The only one exceeding mere happiness was Captain Piątkowski, whom I had invited to dinner. Piątkowski, who sometimes dines at the camp with officers of the 53rd, says that once the tablecloth has been removed, they pay so much an hour to drink, and this lasts late into the night. I can assure you, replied the doctor, that is utterly untrue, and that there are officers in the camp who only drink wine twice a week. This is how, replied the emperor, when you do not understand a language well, a false interpretation is ascribed to the habits and actions of other people. The emperor had gotten into the habit of having lunch in his bathtub quite frequently, and I had made a small mahogany table which, held by hooks at each end, would fit into the bathtub at his desired height. On this table, he was served his lunch, then afterwards he was given his book of papers. He never remained in his bath less than an hour and a half and kept the bath warm by letting a trickle of hot water run into it. One of the gentlemen was called to work or converse with him. Often after having chatted with one of them, he called for another. His baths did him good, and he said that they decreased a dull pain in his side that he had begun to complain about. On June 18th, the emperor was informed of the arrival of the frigate Newcastle and Aranta, which were carrying on board the new admiral and the French, Russian, and Austrian commissioners. Count de Montholon also came to tell him that Madame de Montholon had just given birth to a daughter. The emperor, knowing that she was pregnant, had sent me several times to ask how she was. He congratulated Count de Montholon and told him he would give her the name Napoleon. During the afternoon, the emperor was able to visit Countess de Montholon, who presented her daughter to him. The two frigates had barely dropped anchor in the harbor when they sent ashore the new admiral and his family, the Marquis de Montchenu, commissioner for France, Count Beman for Russia, Baron Sturmer for Austria, and Captain Gors, ADC, to Marquis de Montchenu. Dr. O'Meara had gone into town immediately and spoke with several passengers. When he returned to Longwood, he told me that an Austrian botanist who had arrived on one of the frigates had seen my mother in Schönbrunn before his departure and was carrying a letter for me. To fully understand all the happiness I felt on learning there was a man in town who had seen my mother, one would have to envision the fantasies of a prisoner's imagination. I immediately went to see the emperor to inform him of this. He thought he might also be the bearer of a letter from the empress for him. I had to wait until the next morning, and never had a night seemed so long to me. Since I had left town to join the emperor at the Briars, I had never returned to Jamestown. Without giving the reason I was going to town, I asked Captain Poppleton for a non-commissioned officer so I could go there, and General Gourgaud for 2 horses that were sent to me from the stables. I proceeded to town where no one knew me, gave the officer my horse to keep, and went directly to the house of Dr. O'Meara, had pointed out that of the botanist. It was early. I found him in bed and apologized for this, but he understood my anxiety and handed me the letter from my mother, urging me to maintain absolute secrecy about this. He had left the Empress in good health and gave me the most charming description of the King of Rome. I asked if he had a letter from this princess for the Emperor. He replied that he didn't, but hoped he would be fortunate enough to be presented to the Emperor and be able to speak to him of her. Fearing that too long a stay might compromise him, I left, happy in my good fortune. As I was getting on my horse, I spotted the commissioners strolling about town, staring at the enormous rocks dominating it. Without stopping to take a better look at them, I recognized in each of them the nation he represented. Followed by my officer, I returned in great haste to Longwood. And as I was going up the incline leading to it, Sir Hudson Lowe was coming down to town on the opposite side. As soon as I arrived at Longwood, I turned the horses over to one of the grooms on duty. I proceeded into the Emperor's quarters with my unread letter in hand. The Emperor allowed me to open it and told me to read it to him. I found in the envelope a carefully folded piece of paper in which was written, King of Rome's heir. On another similar one was written, to my son. This belongs to you. The emperor said to me, and this one is mine. After opening it and seeing the beautiful blonde hair of his son, he told me to place it in his travel kit. I placed it next to a lock of hair of Empress Josephine's sent to him on the island of Elba after this princess's death. These are the 2 locks of hair that are today in my reliquary. My letter contained many interesting details about the King of Rome, gave news of the Empress, but nothing gave any inkling that my mother had told the princess about the letter she was writing to me. I told the emperor that the botanist had taken this letter on my mother's repeated insistence, and that had anyone known about it, he would not have been allowed to leave Vienna. The emperor learned through the newspapers of the acquittal of General Drouot, whose noble character and selflessness he greatly admired. It was always with the highest praise that he would speak of him and his fine conduct at the Battle of Hanau. The doctor reported to the emperor that when the governor arrived in town, he had asked where I had gone. No one knew at first what to tell him, but he soon learned that I had spent 15 minutes with the botanist. I very much regret I can no longer remember his name. He scolded everyone around him and complained about the lack of surveillance exercised on the Frenchmen when they came into town. He threatened the botanist with sending him away from the island and would have done so had Baron Sturmer not opposed it. But finally he calmed down. The harm, had there been any, being without remedy. The governor's ire made the emperor laugh when he heard about it. The arrival of the new admiral, Sir Pulteney Malcolm, who came to take command of the naval forces, implied the departure of Sir George Cockburn, whom the emperor had never seen again since the day when, coming to introduce Sir Hudson Lowe, he was quite unintentionally treated impolitely. Before leaving the island, he came to take his leave of the Grand Marshal. He expressed regret that such a circumstance had closed the emperor's door to him, and that he could not take on his duties. Nothing the Grand Marshal said to him on this subject could change his determination not to come and introduce his successor. As for myself, when I learned the admiral was leaving St. Helena without seeing the emperor, I regretted it. The emperor would have no reason to complain about him had his instructions not been hatefully directed at him. And what was happening since Sir Hudson Lowe's arrival would cause us to miss the admiral. He was a man of heart and integrity, but his severe nature and demeanor made it difficult to approach him. The care he had taken on board ship each time we met to ask if the emperor had everything he needed made me feel friendly toward him, and made me recognize that the eyes in his stern face were not without a certain kindness, inviting trust. The sailors on duty at Longwood were sent away and replaced by soldiers. Admiral Malcolm therefore came without his predecessor, asking the Grand Marshal to be presented to the Emperor. His audience was put off until the following day, June 21st, and the same protocol took place for him and his staff as that for Sir Hudson Lowe. Admiral Malcolm from the first was friendly to the Emperor, who, when he had left, said he found he had an open and honest face. This man, he said, must have a good heart. He expresses his thoughts frankly and would inspire trust in the most suspicious man. Before leaving the emperor, he asked permission to come and present Lady Malcolm, who had remained in town. The emperor replied he would be most pleased to meet her. Several crates of books arrived on the new castle and were sent to Longwood. It was a real joy for the emperor, who, as soon as they arrived, helped us open them to more rapidly satisfy his impatience to know these works. He then spent part of the night reading. The next morning, when I went into his room, I found a large quantity of the books on the floor that he thumbed through, he said, which probably held little interest. For several days, he busied himself scanning them and then organizing them in his library. Various toilet articles had arrived on the ship and were sent to Longwood: perfume, cologne, lavender water, Prince Regent tobacco, white cloth, and fabric for suits and shirts. The emperor told me to keep the cologne for him, as it could not be secured in town at present, and distribute the rest among the household. He wanted to wear his clothes as long as possible, as he did not wish to receive anything from the British government. 2 percussion shotguns were sent to him in a box. He told me to give them to Saint-Denis, who was already in charge of the emperor's shotguns and pistols that Admiral Cockburn had given back to him since our arrival at Longwood. When speaking of the shotguns that were sent to him, the emperor said it was a joke in a country where there was no game.